Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. Great to see you again this week. It's going to be another fun one. Just let people get settled and then we'll get rolling. Got a few people jumping in the waiting room here, so we'll make sure they're able to hop in. All right. So I don't know how the weather is in your world, but I'm in the Chicago area. It's been quite frenetic around here. We've had everything from nice, hot and sunny 70 plus degree days to, hey, maybe it'll snow a couple of days later. That's always interesting and fun. Today we had some hail, actually. Literally a week ago, we had like a nice party in the sunshine, and today we had some hail. So interesting weather. All right. We can start to get rolling today, and I'll start to give an introduction. Let me spotlight myself and pull up some of my notes here. And for those of you out on the socials, I'll try and make sure we get a link out there so that you can jump in to the Zoom session. Let me see here, see if this works. All right, let's just change that to this. And yes, indeed, for the 22nd. All right. So I'm about to put a link into socials, YouTube, Facebook, and stuff like that. If you want to jump in the Zoom call, we'll have that available here. Let me see here. Here we go. Hello out there. Join us on Zoom. Boom. All right, all you got to do is just register real quick, and then you'll get a link to jump in here with us, and we'd be happy to have you join us. If you're still a little bit shy, you can stay on Facebook and YouTube. I do try to check the chat. I can usually see the chat for folks that are watching on the stream. So you can try to make a few comments in there. It's a little bit less easy for me to keep track of, but that's fine if you want to participate remotely. All right. So, but yeah, let's talk about what you would be participating in. What are we doing here? Every Saturday, we've been doing this for a couple of years now. It's been quite a fun endeavor, keeping very consistent about it, grown it into various things, had some other events online related to this, and even have a podcast, Piano Tech Radio Hour podcast. So specifically, though, welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. We gather here every Saturday to meet with and learn from the most fascinating and knowledgeable folks in the piano world, including manufacturers, rebuilders, musicians, makers of other instruments, and of course, piano techs. Our mutual goal is to become better at our craft, to help each other and create an ever more musical world together. Piano Tech Radio Hour is brought to you by Piano Technicians Master Classes, an online learning resource that brings you cutting-edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. You can find out more at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. If you'd like to keep up with us, attend every live session easily, and support the future growth of this fine production, you can subscribe at bit.ly/joinptrh. That's bit.ly/joinptrh. Can make sure to check out some of our most recent master classes. We've got one with Doug Gregg on French polishing, which was very enjoyable, informative, and potentially lucrative, I would say. And then also you can sign up to get the recording of the masterclass we did just on Thursday with David Clavins, which we'll actually review a little bit of today so you can get a taste. And that was on kind of piano design and his concept around how you design a piano, as well as steel frame construction, which he's been an advocate of for many years. And so I'll put some of that information into the chat, and we'll also share some content from a previous masterclass of David Clavins during this session today. And so when you check that out, let's see here. When you check that out, if you're interested, you can go go back and consume that content. No, anything that you're interested in today, if you just subscribe for $79 a month for the Craftsman subscription, you would be able to access it. You don't have to purchase those lectures one by one. And I'm going to, let's see here. I'm going to put some text here in the chat of, let's see here. Let me copy that. Let me copy this. One moment. Thank you for your patience. There we go. And perfect. And by the way, the podcast is at pianotechradio.com. Pretty simple to remember. And we've got a good handful of episodes up there. And basically the episodes that we're releasing on the podcast are from about 2 years ago. Gosh, it's not letting me copy and paste this text, which is really annoying. So we'll forget about it for the time being. I'll put that in later. Which is it's very annoying though. Let's see here. Let me try one more time. Copy. Let's try this out. And I think that worked. All right, let's put it in the chat and Zoom here, and then we'll get rolling. All right, so yeah, the masterclass on Thursday was very interesting. It was kind of a follow on to the one that we had back in 2021, where David Clavins explained how he created his Una Corda piano, which he's very much known for back, like the late 70s, 80s, as he was just getting started building a giant, very tall piano, which I basically had to climb a pretty significant staircase to play. And the whole idea there was to be able to create some more beautiful scaling, right? To make the bass strings much longer. And to use some different principles in those designs. And, he's been kind of growing that concept ever since then. It's been quite a long time. He's very happy that he's stuck with, kind of being a bit of an iconoclast and doing something different amidst, the normal progress of the piano industry as it is. And then as of recently, he's actually been constructing some smaller size pianos and exploring designs there and how he can continue to implement some of the principles that he finds important, but to do that in a smaller piano construction, perhaps with less actual notes per piano for the keyboard, less strings per note, things like that. I'm actually going to start off by visiting his Instagram briefly, so folks can get a chance to kind of look over some images of the pianos if you haven't seen them. And there's actually a few audio clips as well, so we can take a look at those. And then we'll dive into some samples of the lecture content after that. All right, so let me make sure everybody's been let in who was waiting. Good. And let me do a little bit of a screen share. We'll hit on screen number 2. All right, great. So you all should be, let me know if you're not, but you should be looking at David Clavins' Instagram page and kind of give you a sense of how unique the type of construction that he's doing is. I might also bring up his website as well. Let's get there. Clavins pianos, that could be useful as well. So I can't explain exactly which piano. Actually, I can after our presentation. This piano is a larger version of a piano he designed recently called the Una Corda piano. The Una Corda piano has a limited number of keys, less than 88, and it only has one string per note, as the Una Corda implies, as the name Una Corda implies. But this piano is more of like if it were a grand piano, but not as tall as his other models. So it's like using the one string per note concept, but using it on a sort of a grand piano style of kind of the length of strings and what you get out of it. And we can take a listen to it really briefly here. And you'll hear it's a very rich sound. It's a very full sound. It's a very beautiful sound. It's a very unique sound. And definitely, worth something exploring, especially for those composers and musicians who want to create unique sounds. Okay, so there's a little taste of what the tone of that piano is. Quite interesting. And let's see if we can go back to his feed here. So you can get a chance of it's also got this very interesting open case construction. So, there's nothing to encase the action mechanisms or anything like that. That's kind of just a matter of keeping it clean through sort of dusting and airflow and things like that. And according to David, that construction has been working fine for him throughout the course of many years. But also it allows him to create a lighter weight piano. This particular piano, the Una Corda, at least, right? The one that's a little bit smaller keyboard. Let me admit a couple people here. The one that's a little bit smaller keyboard, I think it was, I think maybe about 150 pounds or something like that. Maybe less, maybe 110, 100. It depended how exactly, you measured the weight. And also I was converting from metric to United States style or whatever. But yes, so part of the idea behind less encasement for the piano itself is then it's going to actually weigh less. And by the way, this piano, you hear that very rich bass sound. This is not a tall piano. So he's able to achieve a pretty nice bass quality out of this. This piano, he also told us a little bit about, even though it is not steel frame construction. We actually talked about it a little bit. And what he wanted to do, he had a request from a friend to design a piano that could be basically kind of taken out into nature, and be able to utilize that instrument, play, among friends, have a little concert in the forest or something like this. And so he decided not to include steel in the construction as the primary load-bearing element. So it's primarily constructed of wood. And then there is some steel reinforced areas, but very, very small amounts. Let's see if there's anything else of interest here. Another listen to that piano, another look at the construction. It's quite modest in size. And then just briefly, let's take a quick look at the website so you can get a chance to see some of the piano designs for those of you that haven't. Here's model 370. This is the one that was initially designed by Clavins in 1987. And 370 stands for the number of centimeters tall it is. And then this is the Una Corda, which we were just talking about. 450 would be even taller than that original model. And then, the piano that we just looked at is the Una Corda EL. Extra EL stands for extra light. And that's that one where you could see primarily constructed of wood and just a little bit of steel in various areas to reinforce, make sure it's not going to implode on itself, basically, from the tension of the strings. But, again, he's able to achieve most of the structural integrity through wood with a little bit of reinforcement from steel. So very interesting stuff. All right, let me just double check there's nobody else that needs to enter. And let's see here. Yeah, we got at least one person there. And then maybe we have a comment. Oh, sorry. Hard to hear what I was saying over the piano music. Sorry about that. I won't be doing much more talking over piano music, but if I do, I will take that into account. If there's no questions from this point forward, I think what I might do is dive into, some of the content now that you have a foundation for, if you haven't already, about like where we're at with Clavins, what kind of pianos he's been designing, what he's going to be talking about. And he's going to get quite technical. I'm going to get I'm going to give you a taste of the lecture that we literally just had on Thursday. And there'll be a little bit introduction of him at the beginning, so that will help give some context as well. And then we'll dive into a bit of his presentation, discussing the benefits of steel frame. And then after that, we'll jump back to catch a little bit of his presentation from 2021, talking about the road to the development of the Una Corda piano. So I believe you're still looking at my screen. So what we'll do is we'll hop on over here and we'll load this one up, and we'll watch it for maybe 15, 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer or shorter. And then we'll see if there's any comments, questions, and then we'll jump on over to the other recording. We're excited to have another chance to have some time with a very innovative person here in the piano industry, David Clavins. Definitely, I don't know if I ever mentioned to you, David, like the first time I heard of you, I remember I was just driving a car with a friend, and I was in high school. So this was in the 90s, mid 90s. And my buddy was like, yeah, there's a piano over in I think, did you ever install one of your pianos in University of Chicago or sort of Chicago area back in the early, in the 90s?
No, that was it. No. That was in Germany.
Okay.
I had it in Germany.
Okay. Well, anyways, a buddy of mine, I remember telling me that there's a piano where you have to climb a staircase to play it. It's so tall and the strings are so long. And I was like, oh, cool. And that was it was decades before I learned who that was that made that and what was going on. But the sort of meme of kind of what you were up to is spreading around the planet for quite a while. So a little bit of a background on you before we get started. For those of you that may not be aware, Clavins is an accomplished piano designer. He did his degree in Masters of Piano Building back in January 1980 in Stuttgart, Germany. And he founded his first piano company in 1976 in Bonn, Germany. He initially specialized in the rebuilding of old pianos, but in the course of his work, he was studying the factors that mainly determine the acoustic characteristics of a piano. And being the curious and innovative person that he is, he couldn't help but bring us into a new era of piano design. So we'll sit down with him today and learn a little bit about his thoughts on steel frames construction in pianos. Last time we sat down with him, we were able to learn about his thought and design process on his relatively new design, the Una Corda piano, which was kind of commissioned by famous pianist Niels Fromm, right? Is that how you pronounce it?
It's Fromm, yep.
Yeah, and since then has been cropping up all over the place, especially because of its unique portability, in comparison with your previous projects. So today we'll talk a bit about steel frame construction, the limits of cast iron, steel as a static element in piano design, designing the process of designing steel frame pianos. Even maybe we'll touch upon kind of inventing and marketing your own piano design. What's that process like? And of course, we'll have time for Q&A. So without further ado, I guess I'll hand it over to you, David, and you can get rolling.
Thank you very much, Ethan, for this introduction. And indeed, everything was correct that you said. And I have understood after the big pianos, in particular, the first big piano, that some smaller size innovative pianos may make a lot of sense, because there is not so many people who have 15-foot tall ceilings and would utilize the big ones. So thank you very much for having me. And today's subject is the case for steel frame pianos. And the reason for this is because it offers new options of piano design. And to understand this better, we have a short look at the rather boring part of property data on both materials, cast iron versus steel. Starting out with the cast iron, which the basic elementary physical properties of gray cast iron, which is typically used for pianos. It's iron carbon alloys with carbon content 2.5 till 4% and 1 to 3% silicon. Density is about 7 grams per cubic centimeter, 6.6 to 7.4. Cast iron has a good castability, is brittle, has very good damping capacity, which is very important if you design pianos the old-fashioned way or the industry way, and excellent machinability, a low ductility, modulus of elasticity that's expressed in gigapascal, which is a value of around 120, and has a good resistance to wear and resistance to oxidation. And versus the steel, now looking at the steel properties, weight is somewhat similar. Iron alloys with less than 2% carbon make various steel material, so to say, various steels. And it has typically a density of 7.75 till 8.05 gram per cubic centimeter. And it has a low damping capacity, which is one of the reasons why in classic piano building, typically steel is disregarded as any kind of part of a piano frame. But we refer to this later. Steel has a high tensile strength and toughness. It's easy to weld versus cast iron, which is not that easy to weld, though it's possible. And steel has a higher ductility. Modulus of elasticity is 210 gigapascal, which compared to the cast iron, 120 versus 210. So you see it's about it's significantly higher, has a significantly higher elasticity than beans like, maybe not significant, but a third higher elasticity than cast iron. And it needs coating against oxidation. Otherwise, it will, unless you look at some modern designs, they actually love to utilize rust. So in case somebody loves a rusty piano, you don't need the coating. So that's the basic properties. Now looking at, yeah.
Somehow I have an echo there. Let me know, did you want me to share the presentation yet, or do you want to wait on that, the slides?
Yeah, you could also, I mean, depends. You could also share the presentation, but maybe it makes it easier for the people to follow if you share the presentation.
Via screen share? Or
yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let me go on to that just a sec here. And screen, let's go over here. Screen 1, screen 2. There it is. Share. And then I'll remove my spotlight that.
Okay.
Okay, great. And then
we go to slide 3 now.
Okay. This one?
No, next one. This
Next one.
we
Okay.
just looked at, yeah.
Great.
And so now we're looking at the main limitations of cast iron in piano design, which means, of course, the piano frame, mostly around which everything else builds in traditional pianos. The limitations of cast iron, the main limitations are that mold casting is a complicated and expensive process, and thus mostly prohibitive for designing individual builds of pianos. unless you would have a client who offers you hundreds of thousands and says, whatever, but I want to have a classical piano, they would typically buy a Steinway instead. So then cast iron has its limits to size, because extending size beyond the typical concert grand is very impracticable. It becomes too heavy because it's a brittle material. It may even, if you handle it not carefully enough, it may break easily. So the typical concert size piano is about the maximum limit in case someone wants to have a bigger one. Then limiting design options essentially to traditional piano construction, because there's hardly to get a step out of this in the case that you use the inner support frame. We will get back to that a little later. And it's last but not least difficult to find foundries for collaboration these days. If you find one at all, then they typically are occupied with some industrial manufacture of parts like machine parts, motor parts, or things like that, where cast iron typically is utilized. And if you come up with an individual wish, please do me a piano frame, it will be hardly possible. Unless you do it in China, and China asks you how many 100 pieces you would like, or 1,000 pieces of that you would like to have. And it's also in China, even in China, let's say the minimum cost of molding a new cast iron frame is somewhere at least at 50,000 euro, which means like $60,000 presently at the present course, the exchange course for dollar versus euro. So anyway, it may be even more expensive in the meantime. So let's look at the next slide. So the opportunities by using steel instead of cast iron, the major points are that this is extending piano design options to near limitless possibilities. It will become clear a little in the process of this presentation what it means. And it's easy access to a vast choice of different steel materials and standardized profiles, because if you utilize steel, then you typically have a design that consists of whatever various steel parts, which you can easily weld in any shape and size and any caliber of profiles. So any shape and size of the piano possible. Option to make pianos an integral part of the building interior. We will get back to that also a little bit later. Option to easily add design elements to the basic construction. And all of these points, they actually demand a totally out of the box thinking when looking at the piano. The traditional piano, as we know, it's designed as it is. It is a process. It's manufactured very carefully. It has a very nice surface. You wouldn't screw anything to that surface or put nails in it or whatever. You would protect it against the whatever damage. Now, if you imagine steel and the possibilities of steel, then you can, of course, add to steel all kinds of things that are typically not used in piano building, but would be very helpful for the design. So let's move to the next slide. So the main factors to consider when using steel for piano frames, the basic design principle: solid outer frame instead of the traditional inner support frame. That is actually the most important of all these factors, and that also is not so hard to imagine, I think. If you look even at the classical piano, and imagine it would have no cast iron inside, nothing like that inside, but it would have an extremely solid outer frame. Means in particular a frame that covers the pin block and the hitch pin panel. part, then it's not so difficult to imagine that it's doable. And don't even need to imagine, if you look at our una corda pianos or even our 4 m50 concert piano, they have all outer support frames of steel. And then it becomes also clear why I mentioned before that you can add all kinds of things, because you can imagine you could have a basic structure of steel, and then because it's the outer frame and that's steel, you can screw, add, mount anything to it. Let's say you can make a Mickey Mouse piano, or you can make the piano like a wheel by adding round structures around it. Or there's no limits to your fantasy. Actually, only your fantasy is the limit. What kind of design, sculpture type of things you can make out of the piano, though the center part of it would be a structurally fixed piano frame design. So, and the next important point is necessity to take into account the higher elasticity of steel when designing the frame, counteracting partial deformation. That's a very important point. That's also the reason why you could not support, replace simply the cast iron frame by steel material, because those bars of the piano frame would, if you would make them of steel, they would be way too elastic. So the piano would be unstable, not stable enough within itself. So the stability would, strings would make it warp. And necessity to take into account the higher elasticity means that you have to counteract by constructional elements, counteract the expected deformation. And that's actually not so difficult. We can go into that in detail if any of you, dear people, would ever consider trying out something like that. I could also explain in detail what it means. And in general, also at this point, I may mention that I am generally very supportive of any of my peers who would like to do crazy pianos. They feel free to consult with me. I have no secrets by the means that I would not give any advice or suggestion that, according to my experience, that could be helpful in such a case. And the third point is parallel stringing favorable instead of cross stringing for reasons of sound quality. And actually, I would also add aesthetics, because somehow it looks nice. At least my experience with all our clients, all the pianos we make are parallel strung. And actually, I've heard it countless times in the meantime how people like it, because it somehow reminds of the harp, the classical harp. And it's kind of, in particular, if you would consider an open design, which I also favor, without a casing that suffocates the sound, then the parallel stringing simply looks more beautiful. And the positive aspect about the sound is that at parallel stringing, you have only one bridge that reaches from bass to treble. And the section where the bass part crosses over into the middle treble part, there the bridge sits on the same area of soundboard. That means it has a closer sound characteristics in every regard, where the material changes between copper wound strings and plain steel strings. At the cross-strung piano, as you know, the last middle part treble string sits in the left lower corner, the first bass part quite up in the right-hand side of the soundboard. And typically the soundboard has totally different characteristics in those areas. And that's why you get like a bump in the sound balance when you chromatically play from middle to the bass section or back bass to middle section. that's also so an advantage using parallel stringing. And then, last but not least, that I already mentioned, consultations with me personally. We could also, that could also mean some Zoom conferences for specific details, like, for example, how you counteract or what's the design principles of the steel frame, at which part of the steel frame you would have to expect any kind of warping that you had to counteract by design aspects of certain way. And to mention an example, for example, the Una Corda piano, if you look it up, there's quite a lot of pictures out there, in particular on our website, and also on the last slide of this presentation. Then if you stand in front of the piano, look at the Una Corda, then you can imagine that the upper left corner of the piano would typically warp forward, so in direction of the pianist, if there would be no counteracting construction in place. And since this is the left side of the Una Corda piano is the longest single bar of the outer frame, so it is, of course, because it's steel and the elasticity is somewhat higher, it will warp forward. So that's not a problem to counteract. That's one example. It could also be different other parts. So that's definitely, let's say, one option is that in case any of my dear piano technician masters friends in America would ever consider to get really to it, designing their own piano, you can count on my support in every possible way. Let's look at the next slide.
And by the way, I think in a little bit, I think maybe we can jump over to your website too and review some of the images of your pianos to kind of put some of this stuff in perspective and maybe explore the designs visually. I think that could be very helpful. So we'll cue that up next. All right. So that was a little taste of that lecture. We went on for about 20 minutes today. But it looks like, we've got a good hour and a half. We got 2.5 hours of content there in this particular lecture. And so, if you're interested and you'd like to check out the whole thing.
This makes it much easier.
Sorry, let me get rid of this screen share. Yeah, if you're interested and you'd like to check out the whole thing, I believe we put the link in the chat. If not, I'll try to make sure that's there before we end for the day. And of course, we took a look at some of those pianos on the social media as well as the website already. So we kind of covered what I just mentioned as well. What I'd love to do next is to jump into the previous lecture on the Una Corda piano and give you guys a taste of that. It's been a couple of years since we put that one on, so it'd be nice to have a little bit of a refresher and give you a sneak peek into that particular lecture. And again, your options, if you're interested, are in those lectures to either purchase them individually for somewhere around $250, $300 a piece, or if you subscribe to Piano Technicians Master Classes as a craftsman level, you have access to both of them at any time. All right, if there's no questions or comments, then we'll move on to sharing this other lecture with you guys. Let me get that queued up and we'll check it out. And if there are any other comments or things, go ahead and put them in the chat and we could probably reply that way. All right, here we go. So we'll share that second screen again. And we'll get to the full level. And I'm gonna jump in this one about 20 minutes into the lecture where he really starts to dive into the actual project. I think probably around the first 20 minutes or so of this particular lecture is kind of giving some background on how he got to where he was in building this project of the Una Corda piano. So let's jump in here around 20 minutes into that lecture from the 2021 online convention that we did. Here we go. And just quick questions interjecting. There's a couple things that came up and maybe you're going to answer them, but just to make sure. Question is, what is percentage load? If maybe there's a definition of it you're going to present. And a question about safe breaking percentage for bass strings, does the percent load equal the breaking percent? But
yeah, the typical understanding, and let's say the theory is, of course, not of course, but would be at 100% load, the string is close to breaking. And it's actually a factor that cannot be calculated to 100% because it depends on other factors, whether the string, whether you can load it to 110%, let's say practically. But in theory, it's the measure 100 would be the breaking point, 0, it has no tension at all. And so the percentage load that is, I don't know who of you is familiar with Stephen Paolello, the French piano builder, who has developed also various different string categories. We will touch that subject a little later. And Stephen has on his homepage, he has, for example, Excel files to calculate scales, and actually the only factor that is relevant in these scales, or that he shows when you change the diameters, like the core and the copper, the only outcome he shows, because it's the most relevant, is the percentage load. And so that's also by his approach, it's similar to my approach, the most significant factor to determine the scaling that's later, when you listen to the piano, that's as balanced as possible by means of the tonal character, in particular from note to note. Let's say if you have, for example, one note that has 50% percentage load, and you would have the next tone, next note to it, the neighboring tone, 60%, or whatever jump in the percentage load, then you also, you hear a significant difference in tonal character. And I mean, one aspect how I think every tuner has come across situations where you have, for example, an old piano that hasn't been tuned for decades, and it's altogether lower, and you have certain notes that are way lower. And you listen to these notes, then you, of course, you always hear a clear, or the same with the new piano, if you string it, and while has a very low percentage load, you hear a totally different sound character compared to once you put the string on pitch, so to say. And that in itself also is an interesting subject to discuss, and in particular to experiment on which or what kind of percentage load gives what kind of result. And it also, of course, has to do with the question, what do you want? Do you want a loud piano, as loud as possible? Do you want soft, or rather muted sound? Whatever the goal is, so to say. That also influences, of course, the decision how to decide which percentage load you would like to go with. But in general, talking about the balance of tonal character, my understanding, at least to my experience, I found also out that that's really the most important factor to pay attention to, what percentage load the strings have from bass to treble. And there we come also, we will talk about Stephen Paolello a little bit later, but just to touch, not in depth, but one important, interesting factor of defining, or let's say depending on which the sound differs, is of course the impact of string pressure down bearing on the soundboard. And at the factory where I was learning at Schimmel, for example, or also later I understood at other factories, typically they have calculated a certain load, and that's, let's say, extending the bridge height like 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters or whatever measure, compared to the straight line between both ends of the string termination. And then you get a certain pressure on the soundboard, which typically you cannot change. And that's a pity, actually, because as we know, the soundboard the wooden material by character, may differ significantly from piano to piano. So once you get essentially on average a soundboard that has wider grain and is, for example, essentially softer. Then, of course, this one and the same down-bearing has a different tonal result than at a soundboard which happens to have much narrower grain, thus being harder in its F or more resilient. And so that's an interesting factor. Also adding while I was investigating this aspect, I found, for example, some old pianos that had hardly any down bearing anymore. Surely I have come across such pianos, but they sounded as perfect as you can expect, so to say. I was wondering, so how can this piano sound if it has no down bearing, not enough down bearing, obviously. And there was also one factor that led me to think that there's a lot additional aspects to take in account as the ones we were taught in school. And then the interesting, for my personal experience, from my experience, one of the most interesting discoveries was the double layer soundboard, which today, to name it, I generally use at all the pianos that I built, that I'm building. And the Rittmüller Göttingen, it's a shame that now the Chinese have taken the name and are doing lots of Chinese Rittmüller, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the good old Rittmüller pianos. But Rittmüller Göttingen was the only piano that I came across during the rebuilding of pianos. And when I still remember the very first Rittmüller Göttingen, a beautiful Jugendstil walnut piano. And when I checked the sound, I was surprised because it was different than any old piano that I heard before. And the main difference was the tone was more carrying, and it was way more balanced from bass to treble compared to a typical traditional soundboard piano. And though it may have been a little softer if you would have checked it by maximum loudness, maximum power of sound, it was maybe 5%, I would say. I would say rather insignificant, but a little less loud sounding than typically old pianos of that same size. And then I came across the next Rittmüller piano, and the next, and there was quite a number in the decades while I was doing piano rebuildings. And all of these pianos had the same quality. That was actually what convinced me to look much deeper into this subject. And consequently, eventually also led to my decision that I would build my own pianos with a double layer soundboard. Okay, please, next slide. So the vertical concert grand, to briefly touch, was my first big experiment, you could say, in piano building, because such dimension had not been built before, in particular not as an upright piano. And I was, in the course of my experience as a tuner, in particular doing concert tunings, I got more and more dissatisfied with the limitations of the concert grand piano. And in particular, the fact that when you play the concert grand loud, then in particular the bass part gets muddier and muddier. And actually, if you listen to, let's say, Rachmaninoff concerto or Scriabin etudes on a concert grand, it's pretty much, you hardly can define what's happened in the bass notes. Also, that's what pianists say. And also, and that, of course, is, as I concluded based on my studies, very much tied to the fact that the soundboard size, the active surface of the soundboard, is very limited, also at the concert grand. And not only limited by means of size, but also the shape of the concert grand piano, in my view, as I found out, or I'm arguing, is quite a disadvantage for the quality of the sound of the piano. And like one very essential point is, if you look at the baby grand compared to concert grand, you will find out that the concert grand actually simply has a longer soundboard, but the width essentially stays more or less the same. So you have like a pretty narrow soundboard that's simply longer because the strings are longer. And that, as I found out, is quite a huge disadvantage for the tone of the piano. And so one of my thesis is that if you would have the absolutely identical scaling, let's say of a Steinway concert grand or Bösendorfer or Fazioli, whatever, and you would simply widen the soundboard, you would give it a different shape, you would significantly increase the tonal quality, in particular also the power of sound. But of course, as long as you have a scaling that is actually too short in the bass part to create a pure tone, then it doesn't help too much to increase the soundboard alone. So this was the Model 370, I called it. I built it from 85 until 87 as my first to check out various factors, in particular string scaling, extending soundboard size significantly. At this piano, it's like 2.5 times the size of a typical concert grand. And just to find out that actually I built this piano 25 years too early because there was absolutely no way to somehow promote it. The only way that I saw was inviting pianists and recording CDs, and for a while that seemed to be promising, but actually I didn't find distributors for the CDs because they didn't know in which shelf to put this kind of sound and music. And so actually it fizzled out, and as the situation there was back in the beginning of the 90s was rather difficult to continue this work, so it actually was paused for quite a while. The next slide, please. So yeah, 25 years too early, no internet, no other possibilities. And then actually I was invited, where I intensively picked up my piano building work again, was based on an invitation to the USA in 2006. There was an enthusiast, actually. He was a collector of piano historical documents and like a typical lay pianist himself. And he found me on the internet. In the meantime, we had internet, and as soon as it came up in the beginning of the 2000s, I was putting up my website and all my 370 and some concept pianos that I had developed in the meantime. And so he found the webpage, invited me, and we worked intensively on research and development actually for 3 years. And then in 2008, 2009, eventually he went bankrupt, but not because of my piano, but because of the mess that the financial world experienced back then, the so-called banking crisis. And so I was hanging around in the States for 2 more years because he was hoping to find some venture capital, which didn't work out eventually. And so in 2011, I came back to Germany because I wanted to continue my work independently. And I happened to settle in Balingen. I won't explain the details why in Balingen. Balingen is close to Stuttgart and Tübingen, actually like 40 kilometers south of Tübingen. And you may have heard of Tübingen. Tübingen has a very famous university, among other. And there I took over a piano store and workshop, and that was actually my new basis to start continue working on my own ideas of developing pianos, contemplating new designs. The next slide, please. And in 2013, meeting the right people, it happened that I made a positive connection to the leading professor of the University of Tübingen Institute of Music Science. And they had heard about my big piano, which in the meantime I had got down to my new workshop. And they invited me to put the piano at the main concert hall, concert and lecture hall at the Institute of Music Science in Tübingen. And that opened actually totally new doors for the development of my work. In particular, I was now able to invite pianists and who had already heard also, because they came across my internet page or some publications, there were a few, and wanted to check the piano out. And the impact of the internet was actually a crucial aspect from there on, you could say, because of course, easy, I don't need to explain totally the chances or the possibilities to spread whatever you're doing in writing, in sound and video recordings set in, and that changed a lot. Next slide, please.
All right. I'm glad you guys could get a chance to take a look at those. I don't know that I was trying to remember if we actually had David Clavins on Radio Hour, and I don't know that we ever got a chance to. Maybe there's a recording in the archives. I couldn't quickly pull it up though. So it's good to give some exposure to folks on Radio Hour of what he's up to. And, you know, as you can see, a very generous fellow, you know, extremely creative and iconoclastic, and I think also just a great thinker, even if you don't like his pianos or you know, or want to make your own piano or whatever. I think there's some elements there that he shares with what I think. I'm a big fan of Del Fondrick as well. Just people who think differently about the piano. They don't just take things for granted. They ask why. They ask, you know, is there a better way to do things? And again, even if you don't try to do them differently, thinking that way, I think could always be helpful. All right. Well, that's probably going to be it for today. I'd love to see the comments and interaction there in the chat. I just put in some links as well into the chat for folks so that if you did want to sign up for the lecture, you could do that. The individual lecture. I guess what I didn't do is just put our general piano technicians masterclass.com link. If you did want to sign up for our Craftsman subscription, you know, you would immediately get access to basically both those lectures, although the second one we may still be installing in the member area, but it should be there in a number of days. Yeah, so again, thanks everyone for showing up. We do really appreciate you taking time out of your Saturday to spend it with us and share your thoughts and questions and all that good stuff while we're here. So I'll say officially, we've reached the end of another musical journey here at Piano Tech Radio Hour. So thanks again, of course, to David Clavins and everyone here. As always, we're brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, cutting-edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. For those of you that joined us today by signing up for this session individually, you can make your life more convenient by subscribing to Piano Tech Radio Hour at just $16 a month. You get the recording of today's session in our member area, as well as automatic registration for each week's new session. You can sign up at bit.ly/join-PTRH. That's bit.ly/join-PTRH. And of course, in the chat there, if you've just joined us for today, and you are interested in any other facets of the program, we have a Douglas Greg French Polish Masterclass that just came out. That was really great. And then put in some links to David Clavins Masterclass from 2021, as well as the one that he just did. Feedback link. We always appreciate any of your feedback. And our podcast subscription link. If you'd like to go subscribe to the podcast, I think you'll enjoy it. It's a great thing to do while you're driving around or working in the shop, doing dishes, working out, whatever. And we are, if you haven't heard, top 100 performing arts podcasts on Apple in the United States. So we're proud to celebrate that the podcast is doing quite well, and the download numbers are increasing pretty significantly every month. So appreciate all that support, and it looks like any efforts there are to spread the word have been working. So that's awesome. All right, folks. Well, we'll hope to see you again next week. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you later.